The prose of this book reads like a damn panic attack. Good God, what do you know about solitude? What do you know about the loneliness one feels in an attic after the roof has blown off and sailed away like a pair of swan's wings? What do you know about the boundless solitude of the world? It's greater than anyone dares to imagine, apart from a few ecstatic moments when there's nothing you can do about them. But even so, you can feel it in every nerve end. Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Stig Dagerman's 1946 novel, Island of the Doomed, here translated from the Swedish by Laurie Thompson and published by University of Minnesota Press. Stig Dagerman might be my favorite literary discovery of last year. He was recommended to me by Tommy Cunningham, a viewer and a critic. And so late last year, I picked up his Wedding Wearies, and I absolutely devoured it. I won't say too much about it here, as I'm planning, at some point, to do an entire video on Dagerman and his entire bibliography once I've read it all. But I think the way I described Wedding Wearies on Twitter was something like if William Faulkner had written Satan Tango, if that means anything. Suffice to say, upon finishing Wedding Wearies, I went ahead and ordered pretty much every single book available in English that Dagerman wrote. And so I decided to start at the beginning. At the time, I couldn't track down a copy of his The Snake, but in a weird twist of fate, I now have 2 copies of The Snake. Not really sure why, but anyways, I started with Island of the Doomed, which is his second novel, and I really liked it. I really liked it. This is a great and neglected book by an author that I rarely see people in the Anglophone world talking about. This is probably my own blindness, but still, I've come to learn that if you want to talk about mid-20th century existential literature, I think that you should put aside Sartre and Camus and pick up Dagerman. And if you want to talk about stranded on a desert island books, put aside William Golding's Lord of the Flies and pick up Island of the Doomed. Before I get to the book though, I do want to talk a little bit about Stig Dagerman himself, as if you're anything like me, who, again, up until just a few months ago, I'd never even heard of the guy, you may not be too familiar with him, but Stig Dagerman in his life was an incredibly famous and prolific writer, and he was very influential. He was born in 1923, and he burst onto the literary scene with his first novel, The Snake, which he wrote when he was just 22. And this was quickly followed just the next year with Island of the Doomed, which was published in 1946. And this second book, Island of the Doomed, was written just over the course of a single summer, when he spent a summer in August Strindberg's little cabin off the coast of Stockholm, which is a neat little fact. And with the publication of these 2 books, Dagerman became a literary phenomenon. Over the course of the next 3 years or so, he published novels, short stories, essays, plays like an absolute madman. He was a Swedish wunderkind, a once-in-a-generation genius who people were calling Sweden's response to James Joyce. But, like Arthur Rimbaud perhaps, Stig Dagerman's flame burned too brightly. He was a too bright filament that burned out too quickly, as Mark Kolansky writes in the introduction to one of these books, I forget which. Dagerman was a prolific writer for 3 years and 11 months. And then he burned out. He spent about 5 more years alive, not writing, and then he killed himself at the age of 31. Now, the details of Dagerman's life and death aren't necessarily important to approaching Island of the Doomed, but I think that this novel is worth putting in that context, because just like Dagerman's life, Island of the Doomed is like a burst of frenetic energy outlined by anxiety, panic, and despair. Like I mentioned earlier, this book was written over the course of a single summer, of the course of 6 weeks of frantic work. Apparently, according to Laurie Thompson, the translator of Island of the Doomed and one of the preeminent scholars of Dagerman, the last 60 pages of Island of the Doomed was written over the course of a single night. And all of this really shows in the prose, syntax, structure, and subject matter of this book. Like Dagerman himself, while writing it, this book refuses to stop for a breath. It's frantic and disturbed and delirious, and I don't know, It's one of those novels that could only be written by someone still in the throngs of youth, still in the exuberance of youth, as its ambition is only raised by the unstoppable energy with which Dargaman pursues that ambition. But Dargaman wasn't just any young writer with a lot to say. He was coming to terms with the reality of living in a world of post-bombs raining down over Europe for like 5 years, post-nuclear bomb, post-Holocaust. And Dargaman knew about all of those tragedies and suffering firsthand. One of his very first assignments as a journalist was in 1946 to go to Germany and survey the damage, survey the despair of all of these bombed out cities. And he wrote about that in an essay collection published here as German Autumn. They're disturbing and incredible essays. And in the background of Island of the Doom, all of this history, all of this immediate suffering all over Europe is just in the background. Island of the Doom is a horrific novel, one of the most horrific novels that I've read recently. But every single sentence, every single image is bursting with life. The imagery of this book is downright insane. I have like a whole page of notes in my tiny handwriting just noting down the images that I liked. If I had to describe Dargaman's prose by way of comparison, I would say that he is part Kafka, part Jens Bjørneboe, part Faulkner, part Lovecraft, and part Edvard Munch. Though take this comparison, like any comparison, with a large grain of salt, as Dargaman's prose and his voice is pretty incomparable. As the title Island of the Doom suggests, this novel takes place on a desert island where 7 survivors of a shipwreck have washed up on shore and need to figure out how to survive. This book is split up into 2 halves. The first half goes through each of these 7 survivors, and we spend 25 or 30 pages with each survivor inside their head over the course of the same single day. We have Lucas Edgemont, a sort of idealist. We have Jimmy Baz, the professional boxer who, in the shipwreck, became paralyzed. We have the English girl, who lovingly cares for Jimmy, but who struggles with an abusive past. We have Captain Wilson, who can't let go of the fact that this all is in part his fault, as he was the captain of the ship, and he turns into a callous husk of a man in order to avoid guilt. We have Tim Soldier, the servile shiphand who, due to his inferiority complex, continues to need to serve and disallows him from seeing himself as anything more than just a servant. We have the Madame, who is just reeked by guilt and her inability to love. And side note, yes, the 2 female characters in this novel are unnamed. And lastly, we have Boy Loris, who is a young man who served in the war and can't break free of his absurd need to serve some sort of higher power, which used to control every part of his daily existence, but simply doesn't exist here on this desert island. And each of these characters are expertly and precisely wrought, as we get these memories and these memory dreams, as one character calls them, as we're stuck inside their heads for 25 to 30 pages. And these chapters are chaotic and confusing and maddening, as each of these characters are trapped on this desert island and they know that no one is coming to save them. And more importantly, they're trapped inside their own heads, and certainly nothing is going to save them from that. And then the second half of this book proceeds in much shorter chapters where we move fluidly between these different characters as they, over the course of another day or 2, try to survive and try to build some sort of community. It's a pretty classic stranded on a desert island novel where the characters need to try to survive and fend off the dangerous environment that is actively trying to kill them. And each of these characters really represent a single idea or a single desire. This book feels allegorical at times, as we can, for example, read Boy Loris as the embodiment of all of the young men who came back from World War II and are now trying to fit back into normal society after witnessing an absolute hell. But this doesn't mean that the characters are flat or predictable, as often is the case in standard allegories. Each of these characters and each of their point of view chapters are, I think, established brilliantly and with much nuance, as their specific fears and desires are laid bare. And so the plot of this book, on the face of it, is pretty simple. There aren't many things that complicate it. Instead, what this book is really about is the internal turmoil of each of these characters as they come to terms with their horrible pasts and their even more horrible and terrifying present reality. One of the characters early on asks, Was he alone on this hurtling planet, this sand-strewn marble plunging down into the cosmic well? But each of the characters really ask themselves this question at one point or another. So much of this book is description and internalized thought. It's their existential thoughts and the imagery and metaphors used that really drive this novel. There's a moment where a character is talking about how everyone is alone and cast out like a raft at sea. And then we get this really interesting description of humans' inability to understand space. And how when we're children, the world seems so big and vast, but how this space really only expands even more as we grow up. That space is just a lie for anyone who has experienced properly this enormous, all-consuming, embittered solitude, stuck onto a shiny metal field with nothing around you and above you, but the most gigantic, the loneliness of all wildernesses, the whole of space, the true extent of which you never dare to think about while you were living in your hole on Earth. It's like a bottomless well, and you lean further and further out in the hope of seeing water, of seeing something tangible instead of just this terrifying emptiness. And in the end, you lean so far out, you fall, and then you fall and fall and fall for the whole of your life without experiencing anything but this endless falling. And you die while you're still falling, and although you haven't come to any sign of a bottom, you're annihilated while you're still falling and gobbled up by the darkness after your pitiful failed effort at filling it with meaning, the meaning that comes from looking for a bottom. And it's really this agoraphobia, this existential dread that we are meaningless beings floating on a meaningless planet through the void of space. That is the primary struggle with which each of our characters are grappling fiercely. And this is only amplified by their inability to communicate with each other effectively and to form connections. This isn't a novel like Lord of the Flies where the characters get together and they create some sort of authoritative government. There's no community here in Island of the Doomed. They're all too trapped and stuck inside their own heads to even begin to form connections with each other. All of those connections fail. They never get to the community building part of humanity. They're each like the subject of Monk's The Scream, screeching silently into the void and not even hearing a single echo back. Mark Klinger's Going Under, which adorns the UK version of this novel, which I really want to get my hands on a copy of, effectively conveys the overall tone and mood of this book. While almost all of this book does take place inside the heads of each of our characters, there is a very dangerous and very real external reality that they need to come to terms with as well. They're on an island without much water. The primary source of water is this small pond, the small lake in the center of the island, but that water seems to be poisoned as the characters keep hallucinating after they drink the water. And there are all of these evil and predatory iguanas, these bloodthirsty iguanas that prowl the interior jungle of the island as they are plotting to inevitably take back their island, consuming each of the survivors one by one. And the survivors really fear this external world as the iguanas are death embodied, as they slowly creep out of the jungle at night when the survivors are sleeping and nibble at them as they sleep. There's a scene where one of the characters is running through the jungle when he trips and hurts himself, and so he begins crawling, trying to escape the jungle. And he begins to hear all of these iguanas and snakes slithering out to come and get him. Hours passed by, and still he was crawling along with exasperated energy. Thousands of shooting pains plagued his body. His nerves were exposed to every agony homing in on him. Smoke was rising from the ground, acrid and bitter, until in the end he could hardly breathe. This plain was endless. Even when he raised his head as far as he could manage, he could see no end to it. Only this tall, scorched grass with panicles swinging to and fro like hanged corpses high above his head. In an infinite vision of terror, he experienced eternity. All time ceased to exist. Space ceased to exist. He was no longer a human being. He had no human qualities left. What did action mean? Colors faded away. Sound was muted. Thoughts were no longer thoughts. Words lost their meaning. Surfaces lost their edges. Everything ossified, leaving only himself an anonymous being, crawling like a snake indefatigably over this horrific expanse without moving forwards or backwards, since all directions and all points of the compass were no more. Immersed in a hazy dream, he remembered his happy childhood when there was a 5-minute run through what was now eternity. Of course, all of this can be taken as really exploring these universal themes of human existentialism, as the scene really does echo, I think, the absurd horrors of Kafka and Camus. And while much of this book feels so ahistorical, there are very few details that help us locate this novel in terms of time, of taking place in the early to mid 20th century. I really don't know how you could read this novel and not historicize it. This book was written and published just after World War II. The war, the Holocaust, and the now nuclear age that they were entering looms large over Island of the Doom and Daggerman, who is clearly very much affected by these terrors of the 20th century, just as all of his characters are. Like I noted earlier, this novel in some ways does feel allegorical, but that doesn't take away from the surrealism of this novel, but adds to it. The island itself is in some ways Europe, post-war, and the guilt, anxieties, and anguish that each of the survivors deal with are inextricably connected to the war and this past world of yesterday, as Stefan Zweig might say. Daggerman himself is profoundly shaped by World War II, of course, as every one of his generation was. But I think that a large part of this book is really trying to come to terms with the haunting repercussions of World War II and the inhumanity, or I suppose humanity as Maximilian Aue from The Kindly Ones might say, the humanity that just ravaged a significant portion of the planet. And so this historicism is important, I think, though Daggerman doesn't hit you over the head with it. What he does hit you over the head with, and what this novel absolutely excels at, is lush prose. The prose of this book reads like a damn panic attack. It is confusion, terror, absurdism, and anxiety, all expressed through manic prose that is filled with wild and horrific imagery that is super precise. I know his name gets thrown around a lot, especially by me, but the only other author that I've read that has sustained this manic prose filled with this just wild imagery is Kafka himself, and perhaps Mircea Cartarescu as well. The descriptions here in Island of the Doom move between this body horror, as again, these iguanas are coming out and nibbling on them and taking small bites of them as they sleep, and a kind of cosmic horror, all the while focusing so much on the personal existential anxiety and terror that each of our characters are facing as they are facing down their inevitable demise. And the only thing standing between them and their inevitable demise is a severe bout of madness. Island of the Doomed is a work of existential horror taking place in a world governed by cosmic horror. Meanwhile, the great flash of twilight that was hurled through the world singed away the little island where 6 human beings were being tortured together by their hunger, their thirst, their sorrow, their paralysis. Night came and went, days came and went, but hunger, thirst, sorrow, and paralysis came back refreshed every morning. He saw hopes born, bitter furrows growing deeper, beards growing longer and more brutal, bodies becoming dirtier and smellier, hair growing shaggier and wilder, faces slowly but steadily shrinking as hardships increased, clothes hanging looser and being shredded bit by the island's sharp edges, backs growing more rounded and submissive, eyes more defiant and crazed from a lack of sleep and lack of hope, skins rougher, more sunburnt and covered more and more in nasty spots, feet growing more blood-stained and more careless about where they trod, words becoming fewer and more blood-stained and more careless about where they trod, arms thinner and even more helpless, elbows more pointed and pitiful, skin stretching over hip bones, kneecaps, ribs, collarbones, elbows, finger joints, knuckles, nasal bones, temples, frontal bones, jaws, cheekbones, vertebrae, shin bones, thigh bones, wrists, pelvises, and crania. But even so, he felt he was in another world, like a man lost in a menagerie. Maybe he won't find his way out before dusk falls. Island of the Doomed is a nightmarish vision of hell, of humanity pushed to the extreme and is right on the cusp of breaking. And so we, like Dante in his guided tour through hell, are forced to witness the torture of these guilt and anxiety-ridden bodies. The island is hell, and we're witnessing the internal and external torture of each of the survivors of the shipwreck. And each of them are paralyzed by fear and anxiety. And again, like the tortured inhabitants of Dante's hell, they aren't trying to escape. Because that is futile. There is no escape. They're trapped, they're paralyzed and tied down. They're simply trying to convince themselves to find a way to cope with their new reality. And it's impossible while reading this book to separate the reality from their dreams and nightmares, as our characters are hallucinating and slowly running out of food and water, and so they're hallucinating more and more. Their nightmares become their realities. There's really no separating them in this novel, as they have to face down the fact that no one is coming to save them, and all of their deepest fears and anxieties about their own personal fate and also about the fate of humanity are inevitably going to come true. Fear of the impending personal destruction is only heightened by the fear of the impending destruction of the human race. The island is a microcosm of the world, and soon there won't be any humans left on it, and they need to come to terms with them. And while all this seems entirely hopeless, and this book does relentlessly explore the hopelessness and the anguish and the solitude of this world. I think the word solitude appears at least 30 times in this novel, I'd wager. There is a bit of hope in this novel. There's a large debate towards the end of this novel as the survivors converse and talk about whether or not they should build a monument on the island. See, there's a big rock on the island, and they get the idea that they should carve something into it. And they debate what? Should it be an iguana or a lion or something else? And this debate seems rather inconsequential given the circumstances, but this debate is incredibly important, as when someone does find this monument long after these survivors of the shipwreck have perished, they do remain hopeful that someone sometime will stumble upon this island. This monument needs to symbolize their existence. It will need to embody each and every one of their entire existences, as it's only through this symbolism of this monument that their lives will continue to have any sort of meaning, and through this that their life's meaning will be attained and understood by others. Only symbolic? So what? What isn't symbolic? Aren't all our achievements, even if we are struggling in a world where there are millions of human relationships and where we have the destinies of millions in our fingertips, aren't all our achievements so pitiful even so that the struggle we put up for them would be meaningful if we didn't acknowledge the symbolic significance of the struggle, the significance of the struggle as a struggle? Would it be possible to do anything at all, to perform a single deed, when the practical achievements are as puny as they are, if we didn't acknowledge symbols as practical realities? They're obsessed with symbolism, but this entire conversation is really, I think, a conversation about the point of art in the face of death. And it's about solitude. And it reminded me a great deal of Foss's Septology and Edouard Louvet's Suicide as well. And if you'll entertain me, I do want to read a quick snippet from this debate. "I don't believe it's as meaningless as you think, Captain," says Lucas Edgemont. "You say it's pointless to make that statue just because nobody will see it when it's ready, always assuming, of course, we really could make a statue. But I can't believe it would be as pointless as that, even if the situation is so awful that no boat will ever go past and be attracted to the island by the wreck. The way you think, the way you argue, anybody who's alone would never be able to act at all, just because he knows that nobody else in the world will ever get to know about it. And so anybody who's alone ought to be completely paralyzed and think he might just as well put an end to such a meaningless existence." "That's exactly what I do think," said the captain, with a hint of hostility. "That's my way of looking at it exactly. Life is completely meaningless for a solitary person. In fact, and he would die, might just as well die, as you put it, if it weren't for one thing, if he didn't have one thing to live for, namely, his solitude. It's in order to be able to make the most of that solitude he chooses to stay here for a while and carry out all the meaningless acts life demands of him. Great and formless meaninglessness. That's the price of a ticket to solitude." And they go on, and the entire conversation, I think, is absolutely fascinating. And there's this kind of fear of nihilism that, again, has much of Sartre and Camus in it, I think. But Dargaman is just, well, way better of a fiction writer than either of them. And so at the core of this book, there is this fight against meaninglessness, against hopelessness. But it's a difficult fight, especially as so many of the characters give in to this nihilistic hopelessness. This book is depressing. It's harrowing and it's relentless. But again, some of the characters do provide just very slight glimmers of hope. The desire of some of the survivors to create a statue, a monument, to create art. And I know that this is super corny, but it shows the preservation of the human spirit in the face of annihilation. It shows that people, even when they are on a doomed island in the middle of nowhere with no hope of rescue, still have an innate desire to create art. And through that art, to connect with other people and to connect to a higher purpose, even though they know that this connection is perhaps a futile endeavor. And Daggerman himself really embodies this idea. I mean, he was not much older than me when he killed himself, but he left behind some amazing pieces of art that I, 75 years after their publication, have read and enjoyed, and they will stay with me for the rest of my life. Like I mentioned a few different times, Daggerman seems very much in conversation with a few different authors like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, and there are some indications in this kind of biography and memoir by Lo Daggerman and Nancy Pick. Lo Daggerman is Stig Daggerman's daughter and the keeper of his estate, that Daggerman himself was very influenced by the works of Sartre and Sartre's plays especially, and some of Daggerman's plays directly respond to Sartre's plays. And there's a book on this in French by a guy named Pierre Perrieux called Stig Daggerman et l'essentialisme, which places Daggerman within this longer conversation with many of the other existentialists, and places him in this tradition going back to Kierkegaard and through Camus and Sartre. And I've skimmed parts of that book, and it's really wonderful. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to check it out. But I mention this again simply because Sartre and Camus are these very famous European essentialists, existentialists from the mid-20th century, and Daggerman doesn't, at least from what I can tell, enjoy this same reputation, but he really should. In my opinion, Daggerman is a much better fiction writer than either of those two authors. His prose is way more expressive, way more dense, and way more enjoyable. I also find his exploration of existentialism to be more compelling and exciting. Suffice to say, if you are interested in Camus or Sartre or any of those kinds of authors, do check out Stig Daggerman. Island of the Doomed is quite high up on my list of favorite books from last year. And there are really few books that have engaged me so much on the sentence level, on the imagery and metaphor level. Again, every sentence is just bursting with life in a way that really for me last year was only rivaled by Ariana Horowitz and Mircea Cărtărescu. And I'm not sure right now if this is the best place to start with Daggerman, as again, I haven't read all of his other books. I've just read Wedding Wearies, German Autumn, and some of his short stories. And Island of the Doomed, of course. But I do still recommend this book, even if it might be an outlier in terms of Daggerman's style. I'll report back on this though for sure, because again, Stig Daggerman, after reading just a few of his books, he's an author that I want to read every single thing that he ever wrote. Though to be honest, I will be surprised if any of his other books match this one. So let me know if you've read this or any of Daggerman's other works. I rarely see people talking about him, and again, I didn't even know about him till just a few months ago. But everything that I have read about him so far suggests that we all should really still be reading this 20th century Swede. But for now, thanks for watching.